Kyle Mills returns today on episode 472 of Author Stories. You're listening to the Author Stories podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is Kyle Mills. Thanks for tuning into Author Stories. I'm your host, Hank Garner. You can find all of the archives of the show over at hankgarner.com. When you're there, click on the links in the right-hand sidebar to subscribe to the show. I'd like to thank some sponsors for making today's show possible. First off is George Weir with his book Gem of Sky, Book 1 of the Factions of Sky series. Jim is an orphan living in the floating city of Cirrus. As the dreaded Horn attack, Jim and his friends are scooped up in an adventure of a lifetime when the floating orphanage Janus is destroyed. Not only must Jim, Krupin, and a mech named Goat survive aboard a Horn capital ship, but they must find a way to save each other and all of Sky. In order to do so, Jim and his friends soon find themselves in the crosshairs of the two greatest fleets ever assembled, with a battle coming that may bring nightfall upon Earth forever. But there's a hope and a well-kept secret buried beneath a mountain far below in the land left devastated by the 200-year-old Holocaust. Gem of Sky, Book 1 of the Factions of Sky by George Weir. There's a link to it in the show notes. And thanks to Patricia Gilliam for sponsoring the show. Her book, Out of the Gray, which is the first book in the Honaria series. You really want to pick this up. Aliens, Politics, and Murder. Only the first one is new. This is such a fantastic series, and you can get in on the beginning of the series right now with Book 1, Out of the Gray. The Honaria series is one of my favorite series from one of my favorite writers. You're really going to love what Patricia's doing. Thank you to Patricia for sponsoring the show. Also, at the end of the show, we're going to have an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Kyle Mills back on the show with me today. Kyle was on last year, talking about a new book release that he had, in the Vince Flynn, Mitch Rapp series. And we had a great time talking, and, his new book, which is out today, is called Red War, and he is continuing to carry that Mitch Rapp flame and doing such an amazing job at it. Welcome back to the show, Kyle.
Well, thanks for having me.
I'm excited to have you back. A lot has been going on. Pardon me a second while I silence my phone. Sorry about that. A lot's been going on in the last year between book releases. What's been happening with you?
Oh, geez, it's been quite a year trying to get the book done. It was kind of a complicated book to write, as it turned out. I moved to Europe, so that's been a bit of a challenge. I'm living in Spain now, and going to spend a year here. So overall, like a pretty busy year. We had the movie come out for American Assassin.
Yes, you did.
Which was a lot of fun to do, and I think that's about it. But yeah. It's been a good year.
Speaking of the movie, because I had just forgotten about the movie there for just a second, are we going to see any more movies from Mitch Rapp?
I hope so. There's nothing final yet, but we're hoping to see one. I thought they did a great job on that first one.
Oh, they did a fantastic job, and I think it was well received. And so I'm looking forward to seeing what they do with the franchise. It's pretty exciting.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it as well.
Yeah. When we talked last time, we talked a little bit about your love of mountain climbing and mountaineering, all of the outdoor stuff that you love to do. We were talking just before we started recording, and you told me about being in Spain and living there for a year. Are you pursuing some of those kind of adventure stuff while you're there?
Oh yeah, honestly, Spain has maybe the best climbing in the world. And,
Really? I wouldn't have thought that.
Oh yeah, the Spanish climbers are amazing, and some of the best biking in the world as well, and some of the best cyclists in the world. So, yeah, it's kind of a nice spot to be in. I live in the south, where it's actually quite hot, but in the mountains, so you can probably a 15-minute drive from my house. There's actually a ski hill, which is kind of unique because you can be walking around in a pair of shorts and a t-shirt and see people at the bus stop in full ski gear with their skis getting ready to head up. So it's kind of the best of all worlds. And then we're about 40 minutes from the beach. So,
wow.
Yeah, mostly biking these days. I've gotten a little old for the climbing, but I don't know. We'll see. I might dip my toe back in. I'm a bit of an addict. So, you get to a certain age where, you start to fall apart if you go with that too hard.
Well, as long as you don't fall, that's falling apart. You can ease into. If you start getting rusty and fall, that's a whole other thing.
Yeah, well, that is absolutely true.
Yeah. Biking. I don't know that I would equate climbing and biking. What was that transition like for you, going from such a kind of extreme, what we think of as extreme sport to, and biking is too, but biking is pretty accessible to everybody. What's that transition like for you?
Well, climbing was kind of my life. I mean, it was sort of my obsession for so many years. And then I got to an age, the lifespan of a climber is pretty short. And the type of climbing I did, mid-30s, you're kind of done. And I just got to the point where my life had turned into sort of dealing with it, getting injured and trying to deal with those injuries. So, not from falling, but from just pulling on stuff too hard. And, so I needed something, I decided I was going to kind of back off of that so I could, move my arms and hands when I was old. And, I needed to fill it with something, challenging, and, bike. I'd always been a mountain biker, but it was just a thing I did on rest days from climbing, and decided to sort of go full guns into that and maybe do a little racing and things like that. So, it was kind of equally challenging. I mean, more challenging for me because I didn't have the same amount of talent for it. So I had to work really hard for what I got with mountain biking, and, to me, actually much more dangerous too, because while I tended not to fall climbing, I crash a lot biking. So it's been a really fun sport, very different, but you also, I think, as long as you don't crash, a lot gentler and something you can do for a long time. When I'm in my 60s, I feel like I'll still be able to be a pretty good rider, but that would not be the case with climbing.
Right. When you first started writing, I think you were pretty intensely climbing at the time. Kind of climbing was your life, and then writing kind of came out of that, didn't it?
Yeah, I think very much. I was working for a bank at the time, and so I kind of spent my days doing mathematical kind of things and economics. And then, the rest of my life was pretty much consumed with climbing, and I didn't really do anything creative. And that was really the kind of the catalyst for writing a novel. I was going to build furniture, but truthfully, I wasn't very handy, and I didn't really have the space. Then my garage, my wife was not fired up about me filling the garage with tools so she couldn't park in it. So the idea of writing a novel was actually hers, and I thought, yeah, that'd be an interesting project and a fun creative outlet. I'd never really done anything creative to that point, and I admired people who did. So I thought, why not? I'll give it a try. Not really with any idea of making a career out of it or anything, but just really, it was just for fun.
A lot of writers, we spend a lot of time alone, and we sit at a desk and hunched over a computer a lot of times, and one of the first things to start suffering is our body and our physical health. And because, it's just one of those things. You stare at a screen and your eyesight starts getting bad and your shoulders are hunched and you start eating poorly. And, it's kind of one of those, the things of modern life that starts getting the best of you. How does physical activity, extreme sports, or the riding for miles a day, how do you think that complements your creativity? Because that you have to step away from the computer sometimes, and lots of writers talk about it. Even Stephen King talks about going for walks every day and just getting away from things and getting your body moving, get the blood pumping and flowing. And a lot of times things that mentally have had you kind of bound up story wise, when you get out and just get some activity going, a lot of times those things work themselves out. Do you have a similar experience?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm lucky enough to live in, typically, and I'm in Spain now, but the most beautiful place in the world, Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And, I trail run and stuff, and you're out there all by yourself. And it's really important, I think, to clear your head, but it's also time, I think really time that you can think. It's a little bit like the shower, which is another good place to think, where you just it's a little bit sensory deprivation. And I mean, for instance, with Enemy of the State, I remember writing almost that entire book. I was in Tucson doing a trail run in the national park there, and like a 10 or 15 mile trail run. So it was a long run. And you can't wear headphones there because they have rattlesnakes and bees. So you want to be able to hear. And I was kind of getting a little bored. The scenery is great, and I would get a little bored. And I thought, I should just start thinking about my next book. And I swear to God, by the end of that run, I had the beginning, the middle, and the end done. And
that's amazing.
Which typically would not happen to me. Usually it takes me quite a bit longer. But for some reason, that was just a one days. It was a gorgeous day, and I had absolutely nothing else to think of other than not tripping and falling into a cactus. So, that and the shower are two great places to work out all your mental problems.
Do you usually get a story like that where it's kind of fully formed, other than filling in the details, kind of a beginning, middle, and end, before you start writing? Or was this just one of those times where you had the brain power to dedicate to it because there was nothing else to do? But is that a typical scenario for you before the writing starts?
Well, certainly I'm a big outliner, so I don't finish. I don't start writing until I have an outline that I'm really happy with, that's very detailed. So, but typically, no. I mean, I usually come up with an idea, and then it's kind of a hard slog through the outlining phase, because I start with that idea and then I build on it. But I typically don't have kind of a beginning, a middle, and an end. I have a lot of notes, that are just kind of random ideas, and then they start to form a little better, and then maybe I put them in order, start to try to put them in some sort of chronological order. And sometimes, it takes forever before I figure out where it's going to go or how it's going to end. And then, I do research, and then that adds to it, or sometimes subtracts to it if I find out something I said, is impossible. So, that was a really unusual one. I couldn't tell you how pleased I was to get back to the car and think, wow, in like 2 hours, it was still a ton of work to do on the outline and to figure out what the chapters and what the characters are going to do and all that. But I thought, I've sort of got a story from start to finish, like some sort of fundamental, thing that you could, put on like 5 pages, which was a fantastic way to start a book. I think it's the only time in I think I've written 18 books. Probably the only time it's ever happened.
Wow. So of your 18 books, have you outlined all of them? Have you ever started one of your books not knowing where it was going?
Not really. I think one book I wrote that I just couldn't figure out what the end was, and I was really stuck. And it was probably the only one that I've ever had that was like that. And I like my deadline was, your deadline doesn't move just because you're stuck. So I thought, well, I'm just going to start writing the chapters that I've fully outlined at the beginning. And then after I've written a chapter, I'll think about the ending. And fortunately, it came to me before I got to it and was stuck again. But no, yeah, typically I have a pretty well formed idea. I mean, my outline, like this outline I finished and I was going to start writing it. But honestly, the outline just wasn't that clean. So I went back and redid it, or did a second draft of it. But it's long, 40,000 words. So, I mean, it's half the length of the novel. Almost.
Right. One of your books that's one of my favorites is The Immortal List, from several years ago. Mm-hmm. It's this really intriguing mix of thriller, mystery, a little techno thriller, and some biotech, all kind of mixed together there. Are you ever thinking about dipping your toes back into that brand of thriller again?
Maybe. I did that with the Ludlums too. I when I was writing for Robert Ludlum, that was very much a series about that. The main character was a biologist, an army biologist. And so those all had a scientific side. I've always been a complete science geek. So I love that stuff. I read really extensively on it, and I'm always looking for some new interesting technology or some ramification of existing technology to give me an idea for another book. The Mitch Rapp stuff, though, is definitely a little more low tech. I think you wouldn't necessarily want to go crazy, science fiction-y, with that kind of stuff. It's more a more grounded concept for a series. So as long as I'm doing the Mitch Rapp stuff, probably you won't see any kind of wild science ideas like I did with The Immortal List or Utopia Experiment or anything like that.
Yeah. I love that you're able to kind of dip in and out of that. You write the lower tech Mitch Rapp stuff, but then able to unleash your inner geek on some of the other stuff. That's a great problem to have have other things you want to write and just can't get to it yet.
Yeah. I mean, I've always had a really kind of diverse set of interests. I mean, a little bit, I think probably that's a nice way of saying that I'm super easily distracted. But, it's kind of worked for novel writing because there's always something interesting going on in some part of the world, whether it's geopolitical or it's technological or whatever, economic even. There's always something interesting going on in the world that you can write a thriller about. And then some books, like I wrote a book called Smokescreen that, I don't know, it was about the tobacco industry. It leaned a little more toward general fiction. But I had read a book on the history of the tobacco industry, which was a phenomenal book called, I think it was called Ashes to Ashes. And I was just obsessed with the whole history of the tobacco industry. And I thought, well, I'm going to write a book about that.
It's one of the things that's kind of awesome about the thriller umbrella. You can cover a lot of different topics, and still put them under that umbrella. And I think maybe that's one reason why thrillers are such a hot genre and kind of always in vogue. Everybody loves a mystery. You can cover all sorts of territory as long as you keep the reader guessing what's going to happen next.
Yeah, I mean, the thrillers you can really do anything with them. They can be very character driven. You can have, deeply flawed characters like you would in a literary set, more a literary novel. You can to kind of delve into science fiction like I have with books like the Immortal List that are just sort of near-term science fiction, but always propelled by, a fairly strong plot and a threat. And I think to me, that makes a book really fun to read. And but you can still use all the elements, just any element. You can use, I don't do it, but romance. A lot of thriller writers have done a great job with that, where you have a thriller setting, but there's a really strong romantic element. So you can kind of put anything you want under that umbrella.
The new book, which is out today, Red War, which is the 15th Mitch Rapp novel. And if I remember right, Vince wrote 12 of those books, right? And then you've written 3?
No, let's see. I think he wrote more than 12. I would swear this is the 17th.
Okay.
It's 17.
Okay.
Don't. I'm not going to swear to that, but I think it's 17. So this would be my 4th.
Your 4th. Okay.
And Vince, he wrote one book that wasn't a Mitch Rapp thriller, and then 2 prequels too that people sometimes those get dropped off the list.
Gotcha. Well, the first time we talked, I think Order to Kill had just come out in paperback, and we had a great conversation about picking up from Vince, who left us too early. But he had this great series and this great character that he had developed, and people absolutely loved that character and wanted to see it continue. Now that this is your 4th book and you are writing Mitch, how has it changed for you from when you took over and started writing that till now? And we talked about how you had absolutely nailed that voice, and it felt like it was just the natural progression in the series. It didn't feel like someone else was writing, and that's a great skill to put your own mark on something while keeping it familiar at the same time. Do you feel like Mitch Rapp and you have become closer in the writing?
Oh yeah, absolutely. When I wrote the first one, The Survivor, I was really very, very careful to stay close to what Vince had done. I was using his word choice. I don't think there wasn't a sentence I wrote in that book that I wasn't constantly thinking, would Vince have written it this way? And that was particularly important because The Last Man, the book didn't really end. Vince would arc his stories over multiple books. So, it was very much The Last Man was, or rather The Survivor was part 2 of The Last Man. So, I felt really obligated to do something very familiar for fans and to keep it, the goal there was Vince had written about 3 pages before he passed away, and the goal was that no one would be able to figure out where those 3 pages were. So, as you move forward, though, now I'm into my 4th one. That's not as possible anymore because, the world has very much evolved, and very more quickly than you would expect. If I went back in time and told Vince, where are we going to be in 2018? And he would think I was crazy and I wouldn't have gotten the job. So the books have to reflect the world. Thrillers have to feel very current. And Mitch, has to continue to evolve as a character. He can't be, static. You can't have a character 4 books down, into my part of the series that's exactly the same character that, Vince left, because he's experienced all these different things. He's gotten a girlfriend and, he's lost one of his best friends and, all these things make a mark on a character.
I was actually going to be a question that I was going to ask you coming up as, Vince left us about 5 years ago, I think, and the world has changed more in these 5 years than we ever could have imagined, just like you said. What are the challenges for moving Mitch forward in an ever-changing, evolving world while still keeping the essence of who he is?
Well, I think, the ever-changing world is good for thriller writers. I think that you don't get stagnated in one thing. I mean, this book is about Russia, and a lot of people are writing about Russia now because, that's what's happening. We're seeing Russia become much more aggressive on the world stage after, a pretty long period that was somewhat dormant after the Soviet period. So that's kind of a really interesting change. Obviously before that, you had a significant amount of ink about terrorism that obviously is going to continue. But to me, that's one of the great things about thrillers is you're always trying to project out, what's going to be hot and what's going to be really happening a year from now. Because, you start your book and by the time it gets published, it's about a year. And so, if Vince was alive today, I feel pretty confident in saying he would be writing, be interested in writing about Russia. He would be interested about writing about ISIS, which was an organization that didn't exist when he was alive. So when, he wrote very extensively about politics, American politics. And, certainly that's become very volatile and interesting, complicated thing to write about. But, anytime there's volatility somewhere, there's an opportunity for a story.
Yeah. It's really weird that, if you kind of follow the trends and cycles, of fiction, we're kind of getting back to some of the same territory where we were in the 80s, where you could write a book about Russia and everyone understood, these very clear lines were drawn, at least from our perspective as, living in America. And that's kind of in vogue again. It's really strange. And, you see these trends that repeat themselves in fiction.
Yeah. And in history, God, there's a great quote by John Cleese from Monty Python. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it's something like, Italy's melting down, Iran is going crazy, Greece is collapsing, welcome to the 12th century. And it's so true. It's kind of sad. The whole study of history, the point, I guess, is to not repeat our problems, the same mistakes twice. But in truth, the study of history is the study of human beings repeating themselves, their mistakes twice. Yeah. So it is a bit of a cycle, and it's always, you're always telling it to a new audience. You've got a young audience that wasn't around for the Cold War thrillers, but it's humans we're not too creative. We create the same problems for ourselves over and over again. And it's just a question of trying to find a fresh perspective on that and tell it through the eyes of a character that people love.
Right. You mentioned a minute ago that Vince didn't mind getting into politics and really digging deep into there. But again, with the way the world changes, even our politics has gotten complicated, and the political players have gotten complicated, and those kind of traditional right and left definitions are getting kind of weird when you're writing a story, and there need to be some political implications, and you're mirroring the real world in certain ways. Is that territory that just gets weird as a writer to try to reflect what's going on in the political world today?
It's definitely very strange to try.
Do you like the way I just tap danced all around that question?
Yeah, I do. And I'll have to tap dance around the answer. It's a very strange political climate right now. And, Vince, had a very strong political point of view that was conservative, clearly.
Sure.
But I wouldn't say that there's a strong conservative in the sense that of Vince's philosophy, that there's a strong conservative current in the United States right now. So
kinda, but it's kind of a weird conservative current. It's maybe not what Vince would have imagined.
Yeah, it's not what I think. It's not sort of traditionally conservative. On trade or the sort of foundation of conservatism. If you think of like people who read the National Review,
it's not a William Buckley kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. It's not something he would necessarily recognize as conservatism. So you have more of a Republican and Democrat party that's a little looser as to ideology. So that ideology is it flows a little more freely than it once did, maybe. So it makes it much more complicated. And honestly, my goal was to stay well away from politics because of the complexities of it. But I actually find myself writing about politics in the book that I'm working on now, which was very much not my goal, but it sort of just happened. So,
right.
But the question is, I don't know, what's the political landscape going to look like when that book comes out? I used to be pretty good at predicting this stuff, but I'm not sure what the political landscape is going to look like next week.
Right. Exactly. Man, after 4 Mitch Rapp novels, and like I said earlier, it really is to the point where I mean, you are the Mitch Rapp writer now, and God love Vince for starting it and for giving us this character and this deep backstory. But you really have taken Mitch and owned him at this point. Is it as fulfilling for you to write these stories about Mitch as it is to dream up something completely off the cuff? I guess what I'm asking is does writing this series meet your creative needs as a writer, like you hope it would?
Yeah, I think so. I think from a standpoint of the plot lines are a little more confining than when I was used to. I mean, as a writer, I was probably unusual in that I would just kind of write about whatever I felt like at any given time. I think of myself as a little bit, I pattern myself maybe a little by Ken Follett, who just would kind of wing off in any direction he wanted and wrote a great story about it. And
1,500 pages. Yeah,
in 1,500 pages. I can't imagine doing, but maybe they pay him by the word. So now I'm writing a series that obviously has a strong point of view in that it was very much like I wrote a book about an FBI character, and I wrote, I think, 4 of those books. And then I moved away from it simply because he was an FBI agent. So you had a very limited number of things that he could do because, he wasn't going to fly to the moon or anything as an FBI agent. So that is a little different in that I can't just see a shiny object and write a book about it. But as far as the characters go, which is really, to me, what makes writing a book interesting, I feel that I have come to inhabit those characters and to care about the characters. I've created some new ones and, have really come to learn and understand the old ones. So, I think writing a book about these characters is a lot like reading a book about these characters. Every time you start a new book, you get to see what your old buddies are doing. And that's very much the way I've come to feel about it. Whereas, the first one was much harder, where it felt a little more artificial, that I was very much constantly thinking, what would Mitch Rapp do or say in this situation? What would Scott Coleman do, or Kennedy? Now it seems very natural to me. And for me, that's the fun of writing a book, to inhabit those characters and to have them flow really freely.
Yeah. What's your daily writing process like? And now that you are out of your normal surroundings and you guys are in Spain for a year, does that change your creative process? And I guess an extension of that question would be, how important is it to you to get away from the office and to go see new places, meet new people, to continue to write about people and places the way you do?
Well, the first part is my creative, or my process of writing is pretty boring. I mean, I'm kind of a 9-to-5er, so I typically work 5 days a week, the weekdays, and I start in the morning, and then I don't let myself do anything until I've finished what I need to do for that day. And I have a very strict schedule that goes week to week, so I don't ever find myself, 2 weeks from a deadline without a book. I know exactly how many chapters have to be done on any given day to make sure I've reached my goal. So that's pretty easy and pretty boring. So if I finish, if I have some, really short day and I'm finished at 10 a.m., great. I'm free for the rest of the day. If I have to work till 9 p.m., then that's the way it goes. So that's pretty easy for me. It just is what it is. There's no real deviation. And I don't really have...
being out and being away from your typical home office, that doesn't change.
I honestly don't even have a home office. I have a laptop. I just kind of work wherever. If it's really sunny, I work upstairs. If it's raining, sometimes I work downstairs. I've written a chapter in my garage. It just doesn't really make much of a difference to me, my surroundings.
I like that. I like not holding that so precious that you can just take the laptop and, this is the work I've got to do today. So, wherever affords itself, this is what we're going to do. I like that.
To me, the very best thing about making your living as an author is you don't have to be anywhere at any given time. I can live in Spain. I can live in Jackson Hole. I could, do anything I want. And, even with weather, I'm big. We talked about I like going outside and playing, and so I can make my weekend whenever I want. If it's going to rain all weekend, I could just, and it's going to be sunny on Wednesday and Thursday. Well, then I just rearrange my schedule. So I love the freedom of that. As long as you're always keeping your eye on that deadline, it works out really well. And then as far as the travel goes, this has always been super critical to me. I've lived all over the world. I've lived in Africa, and lived in Turkey, and now, in England, now in Europe. Writing international thrillers, I have all those settings. I make local friends, figure out the language a little bit and all that, and say the cultures, and all those things, end up in my writing. I mean, most of the places that I write about are places I've been. There was in the last book a big scene, which is a big nightclub fight in a nightclub in Monaco, and that nightclub really does exist. I changed the name of it, and I was there many years ago with a friend of mine who was a member. So, it's really nice not to have to make stuff up. I hate writing about places that I've never been. I'm writing a book right now, and I just wrote a scene in Yemen, and it really bothers me that I've never been to this port city in Yemen, yet I have to write about it, but it's at war, so I really just rather not go.
Yeah, I don't blame you.
Yeah.
Which brings up the question, how do you write about those types of places? What resources can you pull on that helps you be authentic in that writing?
Well, Yemen's really hard because, the United States has to some extent stayed away from that. So you can't, call spec ops guys or something that fought there for largely. It's mostly a bombing campaign carried out by Saudi Arabia. You can't really go there now. I mean, it's being actively bombed. So fortunately, you have the internet, which, there are a lot of charities working there who post a lot of pictures and stories about what's going on there. You have UN reports and things like that. So you can still get a pretty good idea. It was much harder before the internet. But you can get a fairly accurate idea of what's going on. Having said that, you make mistakes and the internet leads you down the wrong way. And then inevitably somebody calls you on it, sends you an email and tells you made a mistake. So I then try to correct those in later editions.
Well, and the good news is I have not been to Yemen either, and I will never know if there really was a bazaar on that corner or not.
Well, exactly. And the thing is about Yemen is it's really fun because it's an incredibly beautiful country full of these really incredibly beautiful cities and villages. So it's kind of fun to write about, but I wish I could visit. But that might be a few years off. Syria was another one. I was set to go there, and when I was living in Turkey, and didn't for whatever reason, thinking, oh, well, I have plenty of time to do that because Syria is probably the most stable country in the Middle East. And then a year later, it blew up, and who would have ever predicted that?
So crazy. Kyle, the new book is Red War. It's out today. We know that there's a Russia tie-in to this book, but what can you tell us about the setup and where Mitch finds himself in this book?
Well, this is kind of I like throwing new things at Mitch that he hasn't done before and seeing how he reacts. So this is a much larger scale thriller than Vince ever wrote and that I've ever written under banner. Where you're really looking at a war between Russia and NATO. And for this about that before, but it's always hard to put together what Russia's motivation would be for something like that. And I've always been really interested of one of these dictators that's become the Kims and Putin and this eventually becoming ill and then having to cling to power because, they know if they lost power, they have so many enemies that would end up with a bullet in their head. They would end up like Muammar Gaddafi. And Putin's very paranoid about that. In fact, he reportedly sits around and watches videos of Muammar Gaddafi's death over and over and over again and was terrified by the Arab Spring that all these dictators who in a way were much more powerful in their realm than he is, were taken out so easily by the people rising up against them. So the idea here was that what if, Putin, I mean, he's not Putin in my book, but it's very much patterned after Putin, became really ill and had to try to get through it without somebody, figuring out he was weak, and either the United States or the West, or much more likely someone close to him, taking him out and taking the reins of power in Russia, and what he would have to do to distract them, and both externally with the West and internally. And so this is the whole catalyst for this book is Russia starting to act really erratically and not necessarily in their best interest and causing a lot of problems around the world, and nobody can figure out why, because Russia is largely fairly predictable. And then drawing the world into war and drawing Mitch Rapp into trying to stop that war.
It's going to be an intense one. The book is out today, everywhere. Red War, on Kindle, hardcover, audiobook, every way that you consume books, you can pick up a copy of the Mitch Rapp novel, Red War by Kyle Mills. Kyle, are you still posting at your website occasionally, updating folks with what's going on with you?
Oh, yeah. Yep. You can check my website, got Facebook, Twitter. I'm just dipping my toe into Instagram, but I haven't fully figured that one out yet. So yeah, you can do that. In fact, I was just writing a blog post for the website. I'll probably get that up in the next. Well, it'll probably be out. So, yep, I'm pretty easy to find. Look for me on all the social media sites or check out my website, which I update pretty regularly.
Awesome. Kyle, thanks so much for taking time to come back on the show today. We're going to send everybody to pick up a copy of Red War, and we wish you much continued success.
Thanks. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Jason yanked the coils of safety rope to one shoulder and heaved them out the attic window. The bundle bounced over the roofline and dropped to the yard below. He tightened the harness, making sure the shoulder straps were snug over his sweatshirt. He threaded his rope through the braking device, tested it, and clipped everything to the carabiner at his navel. So far, so good. Fireman Mike would be proud. His stomach flipped as he neared the octagonal window. Had he tied the correct knots? Would he get himself killed? Weeks had passed since Mike's tutorial But he had to attempt the break-in now, while both Van Brunts were at the Christmas Eve service. He swung his legs through the window and felt for the roof. His sneakers gripped the shingles and he wriggled out, grateful for once to have feet as big as snowshoes. He pulled on a ski mask and sang, "Spider-Man, Spider-Man, does whatever a spider can." He lowered his body. Wind punched him in the jaw like a supervillain, surprising him. His sweatshirt rode up and snow burrowed into his navel. He looked down but couldn't see his feet. He relaxed his hands and put a few ounces of weight on the rope. Clots of snow broke away, dove over the edge, and took far too long to hit ground. He drew his rope around the pipe and pulled tight. Now he could drop. No, you will not drop. You will rappel. You will rappel very safely. He backed towards the edge, towards the point of no return. The backyard lurched into view. It was a 4-story fall, and he'd probably hit the stairs on the way down. He sledded helplessly. His legs fell, swung, and kicked the side of the house. Alarm bells went off in his head. He gripped the rope. It looked like nothing. A shoelace. "Jason Crane, you're a damn fool." He went limp and fell over. The rope gave a jolt, and the harness tried to castrate him. He twisted, trying to save his poor descendants. He began to spin. His arm bashed through a row of icicles. The spin slowed, reversed, and at last he came to a stop with his back to the house, dangling over the backyard. "Thank you, rope. That's a good rope. Well done." He tried to turn around, but couldn't. With patience, he worked out a method of kicking in circles and managed to press his sneakers to the side of the house. He needed slack. He gathered his loose rope to the small of his back and disengaged the brake. Zip! He fell fast, all his weight on the rope now. His feet, planted, shot up over his head. The brake caught him, and the rope vibrated as wildly as a guitar string striking a note of panic. Jason heard a crunching sound and looked up. The leaf gutter crumpled and poured a stream of bitter ice water into his eyes. He snarled and wiped his face, dripping humiliation. Jason rested a moment and stared at his reflection in the glass. He was an enormous Macy's balloon drifting over New Jersey, tethered at the navel like Underdog. "How the hell did you get up here, kid?" He did an awkward split, one foot above the window and the other below, hanging sideways with his weight on one hip. He closed his eyes and reached for the sill, crouching against the side of the house. His fingernails found the weather stripping, and he tugged. Locked. He cursed and tugged again, anger rising. He grabbed the frame with both hands and pulled with all his spider strength. Something popped. The window rose and the curtains splashed out. Jason dove headfirst into the fabric, wriggled and kicked, let out some rope and fell with a whump into his archenemy's lair.